Today we have MamaLotus, otherwise known as MamaBear, on the podcast, and she's got a very interesting topic for us. Let's dive in.
And I'm not connected to anybody. I said I was connected to anybody.
What's funny is I can hear him in the headphones.
Can you?
Yeah.
And I hear headphones, you can hear him?
And in the headphones, I can hear him. Good evening, podcast listeners. This is Lotus, and welcome to the Socratic Neighbors podcast. We're actually doing a remote podcast here at Mama Bear's house. I called her Mama Lotus last week, and she is deferred to be called Mama Bear. And with me in the studio, my co-host, as always, is...
QuicKarl.
Welcome, Mr. Carl. And how are you doing, Mom?
I'm doing well.
You're doing well? You're our first guest. You know that?
Wow, I'm honored.
You're honored? We're honored
Truly.
to have you.
Thank you.
And we'll probably have you back for one of our anniversary episodes.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, we didn't have any fan mail this week. I was kind of surprised.
No?
No fan mail this week.
So my son didn't write
No,
in?
your son didn't write in. The hardcore addict of the...
Oh, he's at the FBI Academy for the next 2 weeks.
Oh, is he? Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, is that classified or...
I know about it, so it can't be that classified.
So tell us a little bit about yourself, Mama Bear.
Well, there's not too much to tell. I'm a mom. I mean, I graduated college and I worked for a while, but now then I stopped working when you kids were young. And
How many of us are there?
there's 4 of you.
There's 4 of us.
Yep. And
How are they doing?
they're all seem to be doing pretty well, going on with their lives, and they're pretty much grown, and so my job is not winding down, but moving into a different phase, and so I have taken up other interests and focus so that I won't interfere too much with the lives of my children.
And also in the studio with us is Papa Bear, I guess is going to be called, and then Grandpa Bear.
Or otherwise known as Grizzly Bear.
Grizzly Bear.
Oh, Grizzly
And then-
Bear.
And we also have Mrs. Lotus and 2 of the 3 other co-hosts.
Is Goldilocks here too?
Well, yeah, no, seriously.
No, Goldilocks is in
So
Kentucky.
what topic do you have for us today, Mama Bear?
Edification.
Edification.
And most people like us don't know what edification is, but it's basically the idea of how to say something in such a way that builds people up rather than tears people down. And basically it focuses, I went to a talk this week and it was focusing on, are you being a help or are you being a hindrance in communicating with other people? And I would expand it not just in our communication, but in how we interact and how we act toward each other. Because I think a lot of people are very concerned, and justly so, that given our political environment and sort of the social things that are going on right now, there tends to be a lot of us clawing at each other and tearing each other down rather than dealing with conflict in such a way that it builds up the other person and yet you still get your point across. Or perhaps it's time to defer. You need to be sort of discerning that perhaps this it's not worth fighting over. It's more important to care about the other person than to be destructive to that other person, and you're not really accomplishing. And I would say, there is more than one way to skin a cat. In other words, which sounds kind of gross, but there's more than one way of approaching a problem, and that we need to be more creative and thoughtful, intentional, as my daughter would say, in how we communicate with other people. And
Could you address Congress?
Yeah, it's interesting. In my industry, in my field of work, we refer to it as constructive criticism versus just either criticism, or positive criticism is like versus negative or like just not liking something, because that doesn't help somebody say I don't like it. Like when you create a product or a show or something that you just say I don't like something, that doesn't really help. That doesn't help the process of making it better.
Well, also too, if you're talking to someone and you're trying to get them on the same page as you are, and they're resistant to it, you've got to come up with a way to get them to come around to your way of thinking, for one thing, and secondly, if you're giving them criticism or you're trying to help them get better at what they're doing, you've got to approach it in a way that doesn't make them feel bad or like you're putting them down because they don't know something. You're talking about building them up. You've got to place it in a context where you're doing fine, but these are areas that we can work on to get you to where we want you to be. And then that person's not going to necessarily walk away muttering under their breath and calling you names. They're going to be thinking, wow, I actually don't feel bad about them telling me this.
Right.
Well, and I think an attitude that often isn't, or an approach that often isn't taken up is where you move it to the third person or move it back to yourself, where you say, rather than saying, you have a problem in this area and I'm going to help you, you're saying, I used to have a problem in this area, and at first, this is the approach that I use because a lot of us travel along the same path. This was an approach that I was using and it wasn't working. And someone or somehow I came upon a different path, and this path is what's working for me and has caused a positive influence in my life. So rather than saying, you've got a problem, and let me help you get out of your problem, I'm pulling it back on myself and saying, I once had a problem and I see that you struggling in this same area, and this is how I approach the problem that I had. So it, rather than saying there's something wrong with you, you're saying this is something that worked for me, maybe it'll be helpful for you as well. So it's building them up rather than saying there's something wrong with you.
It also lends itself to leadership as well.
And and I remember I had struggled when I was young with some bosses, and they really you could see the different approaches, and some bosses were better than others. But then when I first moved here to Texas, one of the first jobs I had, I saw a whole different approach to leadership, where it was, as a boss, my boss then said to me, my job is not to tell you what you're doing wrong. My job is to help you be the best and offer the best support to you to do the best job possible. And it was such a different approach to me. I thought, this is amazing.
Yeah, I like your analogy about you going through something and finding out ways that helped you get through something that maybe that person's not doing well, and you explain that. That would make me feel like you've walked in those shoes. You're not just dictating to me. I've had bosses that try to reinvent the wheel or fix things that aren't broke, and it's just frustrating. That I know more than they do, and it's not being an attitude thing. It's just that when you approach something like you just said, where you can this is something to help me, and I'm not telling you to do it this way, but I'm it's something you can try. It's something that you can do that might work for you, because what you're doing now is not working, and I've been there. I know what you're talking about. I like that analogy.
And it also, I think what it does with the person is it starts to stimulate the idea of there's more than one way to skin a cat. In other words, there's a different way to approach a difficult problem or a problem, something I'm struggling with. And it may not be the approach that Mama Bear took, but it's also not the approach that I was originally taking. There might be a third path that would lead to what works for me. It might be a little bit of Mama Bear's and a little bit of what I was doing wrong, but it's something that leads the right way.
And saying this with using this with a job, do you think that those same skills parlay to your family life?
Definitely. And I think particularly in a marriage, it's difficult because you're living with this other person. And I think in a marriage, it's a good idea to approach an idea where you're putting it all together in a third person category. I think where I've communicated difficult, that's stressful area for me is I do best when I even pull it totally away from myself and away from him, and I say, okay, this is like a totally objective, give an analogy, and we don't use a lot of analogies a lot in our communication anymore, where you're talking to this person and saying, what you're doing is sort of, it's hard for me to say it without giving a specific incident, and I don't want to do that to Papa Bear.
No. Well, let me ask you this: how would you say your approach that you use was influenced by your father or your mother
or my mother?
I mean, you learn life skills from them.
Yes, I did.
And so when you had your family, did you pass that on, or did you have a whole different agenda?
A little bit of both. And I think one big thing that I learned from Grandma Bear, my mother, was that there's a sort of a time and a place for things. And my mother was very insistent with me that the minute a man walks in the door is not the time to dump the laundry in front of him, which is a good analogy. In other words, you've been home alone with these 4 kids for 3 days, sometimes in my case, and it's not the time to tell him, as soon as he walks in the door exhausted, the dishwasher's not working, the dog has been sick, the car is making a funny noise, and the kids are driving me crazy. It's like when he comes home, I don't want to be dumping my laundry on him. I want him to feel like this is a good space, that we're happy to have him home. And I feel blessed in that it was difficult for me, for my husband who travels quite a bit. It was difficult for me, for him to be gone a long time. But especially when the kids were small, it was like every time Dad came home, this was a celebration. So Dad's coming home, so let's clean house, let's get all ready. So when Dad comes home, everything's really nice and we're happy to see him.
Well, and it was more, I think it was also, you get to spend, is either you do chores now and you get to spend time with Dad, or you do chores later and you don't get to spend time with Dad. Like, that's the way I looked at it, I think, with that.
Yeah, and also the idea of a preparatory and a celebratory time of Dad was coming home. And that way, when he walked through that door, he had 4 excited kids that no longer had to do chores, and he had 4 excited kids that were glad to see their dad, And my mother really reinforced with me, and I still to this day, if there's something wrong, unless it's life or death, it's waiting for the next day.
Right.
For me to
something else that you hit upon, and I just want to expound on a little bit. So the idea was, obviously, you didn't want to have a bunch of stuff laid on your husband when he comes home after being gone for so long. Did that also happen? Did you also try to, like, not that your sons or daughter would ever get out of line, but did you try to
Wait for
take
the
care?
disciplinary.
Yeah, take care of those problems, so that the dad doesn't come home and he's the bad guy the minute he walks in the door. He wants to have a good relationship with the kids because he's not there all the time.
That's exactly right. Yes. Putting off disciplinary problems to discuss that with him. I usually try to discuss that with him at a later period of time. And I'm not saying I always did it perfect every time, because there's times when my hair was big patches was being pulled out, but I think he understood that if there was a time when he came home and it was like that, it was not the norm. That of course there's going to be times.
And you probably talked to him even before he came home. I'm sure you talked. I don't know if you talked every day, but you
Yes,
probably
we talked.
you probably filled him in on some things so that
Right.
he wasn't hit with everything the minute he walked in the door, like you were saying.
Right. But also I tried to do it in such a way for him, and for him traveling so often, I try to share good things, probably good things more than bad
That's good.
things.
Yeah.
So also I remember one time him saying that he saw the children and some of their major events through my eyes, so that when he wasn't able to be there, he actually saw the event through my eyes, because I was able to tell him about it, right away, and tell him about. I really made a point of telling him things that were going well, focusing on those rather than things that were going not so good. But also, to be fair to him, he is a father. He needs to know the negative things as well.
Sure.
So, and I think that would be a good analogy. Like if I was talking to a young mother and a young wife, and she was saying that this might be a stressful area, I might say, you don't want to be dumping laundry on your husband the minute he walks in the
Right.
door, rather than saying you shouldn't talk to your husband that way. There's a very different approach. And I think too, I've talked to other young women about, really sitting down when you're angry at your spouse, thinking of a different way of approaching it and waiting for a good example of, like, waiting till they come frustrated with the situation with you that's similar to the frustration you have with them, and they're angry with you about something, and then you can say, well, when if you could say this as calmly as possible, this is how I feel when you do this. Now you understand. Now I'm not saying don't set it up. In other words, that's a bad thing in a marriage, is to set the other person up, and a gotcha. Any type of communication should never be set up. There should never be a gotcha. But at the same time, I think it helps the other person understand, well, you're right, I shouldn't have done that. But there's times when, this is also similar to how I feel when we have this problem. Does that make sense?
Sure. But on the other side of that, you can do everything perfect to get that communication back and forth, but it takes two people. So
Exactly.
So if that other person's not responding to, even though you're doing the correct thing to get it there, it's got to be a give and take, and if it's not, then it's just going to be one-sided, and you're not going to get to the point that you're trying to get to.
Right. But the hope is, and the prayer is, that especially if you and a spouse, that you're not against each other, that you're fighting a good fight,
yeah, of course,
to build a good marriage and a good foundation.
Right. So in a situation like that, where let's say it's one-sided and you can't get the other side to bend or to come to your way of thinking, or communicate and give their idea and their thoughts, so you have a two-way communication going on. Do you ever think that I like you were saying earlier, there are other ways to skin a cat? Do you come up with alternatives that, like, okay, I'm trying to communicate with this person, I've gone all the routes that I normally go that usually work. This person's not responding. So, but I still want to get them to the point where I want to get them to. Can you do? Is that when you start thinking, okay, what other things could I do? What other options I do? I don't want to just give up and say, well, I did everything I normally do, and now we're at an impasse. Would you think that, okay, to help get that person to where I want them to be in our relationship, or to be communicated with each other? Is that at the point where you decide, I'm going to start looking at alternative things that we can do so we can still get to the same page?
Usually, if I'm starting to get, I think you're talking about frustration. You're getting to that frustration level.
Right.
I think when I get to a certain point where I'm a little frustrated, I think it's time to take a break. And when you have, like I tried to communicate to my children, there comes a time in a marriage where you have to close your eyes. In other words, when you go into a marriage, you're marrying the whole package. You're marrying the good. You have good reasons for marrying them, and you have not always such bad. You also may have. There's things about them that are not perfect.
You might have a good list and a great list, but you don't want to have a bad list, because if you have too many bad lists, then you shouldn't get married.
Right. Well, you've got to decide before you get married.
Right. And you're smart doing that, going down the list.
Well, and like I told them, what you've got to do before you get married is look at the bad list and say, can I live with that the rest of my life?
Right, exactly.
And when you because there's going to be more surprises in a marriage. In other words, there's going to be bad things that you don't want, that you didn't realize this person had.
Right, and they could change after you've already gone through your list and you thought you knew the person. And then you get married, and they're not the same person.
Yes, they could, but
I'm not saying that applied to you or myself, but it does happen.
But
yes, it does happen.
But at the same time, people change. People also
sure
change.
They do, but sometimes they don't.
It's true. That's true too.
But there's usually indicators with bad, and you've got to look at those bad indicators.
Right.
You got to look into before you get married. You got to have your eyes wide open.
Right.
And be looking for these problems.
Okay, let me ask you something.
Wait a minute. We got to stay on the subject before you ask me. And when you're running into an impasse, there comes a time when you have to close your eyes, when you get to the frustration area, and realize this is the person that I married, and I need to give it a break, because I married the whole person, and I said when I married this person that I was going to live with these negatives. And actually, for me, I notice more of the negatives about myself. If you end up doing that, you end up noticing the more negatives about yourself, and it motivates you to change yourself when you accept that person with their negatives, especially when you get to an impasse. Now there may be issues. There's obviously issues that you can't ignore in some bad marriages. Like, you can't just close your eyes to infidelity. I'm talking, to me, that's an extreme. There's obviously areas that you really need to get help, or you really can't live with, and that you didn't know beforehand. But as for the ones, the irritants in a marriage, you can't focus on those. And you've got to allow the other person to grow.
Right.
In their own way. And it may be that you're not going to be the one that helps them.
Yeah, you don't want to smother them.
No, and you don't want to drown them in your criticism.
Right.
Like, I know a lot of women that, they want their husbands to help them, but every time their husband helps them around the house, they go around and redo it. Well, after a while, they can't understand why their husband stops wanting to help them around the house.
Right.
It's because they never do it right, and then they have to redo it, and then they're real critical, and the husbands are like, forget it. But if my husband did that to me, I would say, forget it.
And then there are the clever husbands that are purposely not doing it correctly so they don't get asked to do it anymore.
That's true. but that's a fault on his part.
Right.
And, everything has a price, and it's like, well, yeah, I will take up the slack, but that means I have less time to do and, for us to do the things together. And it's hurtful to the relationship, So, is that the price that's, you may say, your attitude here is, there's a price to it, And if you're not willing to meet me, what can I do about it? You've decided not to help me in that way.
So then at that point, you've got to come up with an alternative to make it work.
Yeah, you've just got to accept them for what they are and focus on the good points, and, there's no use you beating your head against the wall.
Right.
For another analogy.
I find this interesting because it's well, Brian was married 30 years, and then you were married
35.
35, and you've been married
33.
And so, like, for me, the edification comes into play with me asking for you for advice, because there may be situations maybe very similar situations that Mrs. Lotus and I have conflict, and they're settled in an impasse that you and PapaBear have come across that I might be able to benefit from, knowing that, okay, that worked in our favor, or maybe that didn't work in our favor, and it helps with younger marriages figuring out the best way to go, not the best way, but a different way to go about handling a situation that, to young people, we're impulsive. We're impulsive. We want an instant satisfaction and instant gratification. But at the same time, when you're in marriage, you're in it for the long haul. You're not in it for instant gratification. It's a long haul decision.
And part of it is just inexperience on your part, and partly too, young marrieds are finding, that didn't work.
Right.
And if we can help you, and it's particularly, I think, in the Bible, women are commanded to help other women deal with issues in marriages, and that's really important.
My wife had a favorite expression, and that was, "You don't tell me anything." And in my work, I couldn't tell her anything. I always told her, if I tell you what I do, I'll have to shoot you.
Yeah.
But that wasn't the thing. If we were having a discussion about something, and she got to a point where she didn't really want to agree with me, that was always her out.
Her fallback.
Yeah. You
But
never tell me anything.
Yeah,
I
but
can relate.
My mother was also the kind of person that wanted to know everything. Everything.
Yeah. So,
okay, now we've talked about the home, but I thought we would move on to the community.
So the community, yeah. So I think the community.
Now I'm talking about here, like your neighbors, your area, your
Right.
teachers, the people you deal with one-to-one every
Right,
day.
and how even how we deal with businesses and things like that, because like
Work, coworkers.
right.
You really want me to talk about the neighbors?
How appropriate.
No, it's how we handle situations and how we talk to each other is very, because you still have to cohabitate with people. Somebody moves across from you or moves next to you, or this guy decides to live downstairs from us.
Right.
It's you have to interact with these people every day
Right.
at some point, or more than just, hey, how you doing in a grocery store.
Right. Well, and conflicts, even living with neighbors, come up. And how can you approach a problem? Sometimes how do you approach a problem? Because usually when we have a problem with a neighbor, we just kind of quickly, it's easy, at least for me, to go to the negative. Oh, they shouldn't have done this, without even looking at their circumstance. And sometimes when you go into it with more open, it's like, I noticed this happened. Is there something going on with you? And, or, we have this concern. How do you think we can best handle it?
Do you ever talk to your other neighbors and see if they've had the same, not confrontation, but the same feeling that you've had when they've talked to this neighbor, or they had an indication with them?
Yes. Yeah, we have one neighbor that's, particularly here, one neighbor that's very easy to get along with. Actually, several neighbors that are very easy to get along with, and one that is particularly challenging. Mostly they keep to themselves, which is fine.
And they may not be bad people. They just like keeping to themselves. Or have you had actual problem with them?
Yeah, I would say we have, and others have as well. And so, I mean, to say they're on the defensive would be an understatement. But most of the time they keep to themselves. And I just try to, whenever I do approach them, to assume that they're not angry with me, and that they're, be pleasant, even though in the past we've had some difficulty.
Does that trigger something whenever you see them? That something that happened in the past with them?
Of course, that's your last interaction is the first one that pops.
Right, right. But you're not dwelling on it when you're not around them.
No.
Well, that's good, because sometimes it eats at people.
Right, and that's a good point. Is that when you run into it? I think we as women, particularly, tend to review in our heads interactions more than men do. Men are, what do they say? They have their little boxes. They put it in a little box and shove it somewhere, and they never think about it again. But women are constantly reviewing and rewinding.
Everything is connected.
Yeah, everything's connected, but also everything gets rewound. And which is, in a way, it's a good thing, because then it helps you take that different approach. Like, I had a conflict with a person over the phone over something that was handled poorly, and they automatically made some assumptions, and they were very defensive, and they weren't letting me talk. And I started getting defensive, and now I'm thinking, how could I have approached that? By the end, when I finally got them to listen, they backed down and they calmed down, which to me indicates that I was handling it more appropriately,
But then on their end, they're probably thinking the exact opposite.
Perhaps, but she was calm.
I'm not saying that they were right. I'm just saying, but that was their perception, maybe.
Maybe. Well, she definitely I had the feeling when I got off the phone that she still thought she was right. But I think that she was making some assumptions on my part that I had already made a mistake. And when I explained to her this mistake was not made on my part, and that it was one of her employees that had made this mistake, and I gave her the proof that I had, then she did calm down. But it was very difficult for her even to get listening to me. She wanted to speak over me every time I started to speak. And then she told me, oh, you need to listen to me. So I let her speak, because she was right. In order for her to calm down, she needed to be able to speak. And so I let her speak. And then I was trying to answer her back, and she kept talking over me. And I said, wait a minute. I gave you a chance to speak, so now it's time for you to give me a chance to speak. And And that's when things started calming down.
Yeah, and I'm sure you're in your situation. Everything was right. In her situation, she deals with hundreds of people every day,
That's exactly correct.
and because of that, you're. I know a true customer service person should treat you as a person, be nice to you, and listen to everything you have to say, and get the problem solved. But unfortunately, they take 100 calls a day. And then they're at a frustration point, and it's like, I'm just going to snap at the next person that ticks me off, and it's not your fault, but they've been pushed to it.
That's correct.
So a good thing to do.
People are not, we tend to think that everyone we speak with is an isolated incident, and it's not. They all have their own
right. But just a tip for you: the next time you have to make a phone call, find out what time their call center opens and call right away.
They called me.
Oh, okay. Because I've found in the past that if you wait later in the day, they're burned out.
Well, this was pretty early. It was in the morning.
Yeah.
And they called me.
They called you. Okay.
Yeah. So, but and also I try to look at it as these things happen. And yes, obviously they had a problem in the past, and that's what they're jumping to the assumption that this is the same problem. But in the end, she realized that perhaps I was correct in my in what I was addressing, the concerns that I had. And
it sounds like you were able to diffuse the situation to the point where she was listening to you.
Yes. So at least partially, she still was pretty defensive, but I think I should not have been quite so defensive. And that's my evaluation. It's good to reevaluate interactions.
Well, see, as a customer, though, you have free reign. You can do whatever you want. You're not answering to a boss. You're not following company guidelines. You can call the person whatever you want, do whatever you want. And in her world, she's probably trying to reel you back in, even though you weren't out of control. But again, she sees this stuff every day, and it's nothing personal against you. But it sounds like you handled it really well. So you at least got to a point where you got everything solved.
Pretty well. And I think that I would just like to have not become, even though she was defensive as soon as she got on the phone, was to find a way to handle it so that this calm conversation happens sooner and not allow my defensiveness to.
Right, and it sounds bad on her side that when you're making the call to a customer, you have all these facts and everything in front of you, so you should have an edge on the conversation instead of you calling them and now they're caught off guard.
Right.
So that is back on her because she should have had everything in place when she called you.
But the problem was she was looking at there was a receipt involved, and she was looking at the top of the receipt, and the thing I was issuing was further down on the receipt. And if she had looked further
down, she would have found it. I got you.
Yeah.
I get it.
And then once I explained to her the price difference, she was like, oh. So, that's when things really calmed down, that I hadn't paid for the lower service, I had paid for the higher service.
Right. And they're set up to have this guideline, and they have certain answers they're supposed to give to certain questions. And if your answer or your question doesn't fit into that guideline, they try to find an answer that will fit into that guideline instead of dealing with it as an actual person. They're following a company line. And that's very frustrating when your problem might be a little bit unique and they're not actually listening to you, because then you get to the point, are you listening to what I'm telling you? Because you're not even addressing the question I asked. And it's because I don't want to say they're robots, but they get in a robotic mode.
Well, and they obviously had run into a similar situation where the customer had been incorrect, probably more times than this particular.
Right, so they threw that back on you. Right. I got it.
And that I understood.
Sure. I run into that all the time with my business because my business is heavy on the emphasis of customer service. Is that we run into a situation where the customer will not necessarily create a problem, but try and cheapen them, get themselves out of paying for something that they've received. And so there might be some issue with the product or the service that was provided, and then it's a matter of it's a matter of letting them talk first and addressing and making sure that you're encapsulating the whole situation, because if you don't encapsulate the whole situation, you may target the wrong thing to resolve, because they may get ticked off, in one particular facet of whatever the service is, and then come to find out they weren't actually ticked off at that. That's what set them off, because there was another bigger problem behind it that they were just tolerating until a small problem ticked off the big problem.
Yeah.
And so then you have a chain reaction of events. And so the small problem they're willing to pay for, but that's what set them off. And so really we resolve some of the problems that happen with the big problem. And so, like, I had a customer that didn't order, that said that they were going to bring their own equipment for a particular item, for a particular conference, and they got everything set up, and then the item that they had told us that they were going to bring, they didn't bring, and they said, "Well, you guys said you would take care of it." And so we go back through our notes and all this stuff. We get, like, the sales guy goes through all of his rhetoric that he had with the customer. I went through all of my rhetoric that I had with the customer. I went through all my rhetoric that I had with the host location and all that stuff. Come to find out, they were actually upset that we didn't have a particular item that they canceled, which was different than the item that they were asking for. And we had the items on site, ready to go, both of them ready to go. It was just a matter of having them, just attaching them to what they were, just putting them on the floor and then going. But it's very interesting how even the customer and then service provider interaction relates to this topic. You know what I mean? You know what I'm trying to say?
Yeah, but you know what? Okay, so technically, it was their fault that they didn't convey to you.
Right.
But then how do you handle it as a company so you don't make them mad?
Well, as a company, I mean...
Because you want to keep their business, and you want to...
Well, I mean, as a company, what we do is if it's a really bad situation, then we try and discount the product so that they're still paying for it, but they get it at a discounted rate. But sometimes when we do that and they're in a bind, and they accuse us of it being our fault and they're in a bind, then we discount it, or we just put it on the floor and then we deal with the pricing later to let the situation diffuse and let the conference commence.
What do you do when you have a customer the same customer constantly doing this, and you're starting to lose money because you keep helping them out in these situations?
Well,
you have to cut your tie at some point.
There's a drop off point for us. So there's a drop off point for us where you you help the customer to a certain extent. You try and, because our company motto is always try to say yes to the customer.
Sure.
And so there is a certain drop off point where it's not of value for us to do business with them. So if they start trying to trick us into giving them multiple things, we documentation. We record everything that we give away. So we have documentation that if a customer does this multiple times, if they're a recurring customer and they do this multiple times, then it's usually we catch it by the second time that they do it. So we know we have the expectation that the next time that they come in, if they come in at all, they're not getting it. You know, we've comped this to you. We've either comped this to you twice, or we've discounted this to you twice already. We can't continue to do business with you if you're not willing to pay the appropriate amount for the client. Or what our sales guy does is because if you negotiate with us, if you give us enough notice, then we'll negotiate the price down early, so that you get that you can get what you can afford. But if you show up on site and start suddenly asking for something, we may not have that available, so we have to send somebody to go and get that piece of equipment.
Right.
You know, and so
let's negotiate the price and everything included, because we know what you're going to need
right
before you get out there. But be aware that if we get out there and you wanting something else new, then that price will go up.
Yeah, or we may not have it, and that you're going to pay full sticker price for
right.
it.
And that, I think, part of it too in dealing with personal, community, or even society is understanding that being right, is being right more important than saying that something that's destructive. If you can find common ground with a person, if you can find, okay, what do we agree on, and start from that basis.
Right.
And then move on from there. Okay, let's move from where we agree, and we can narrow then down where we're having our problem. Let's find common ground. And I think that's a good way of dealing with people at a personal level,
our government
level, and a governmental level.
Yeah, politically,
yeah.
Or society.
Right. But if you can find that common ground, and you might not get everything you want, but at the end of the day, you can disagree to agree, or agree to disagree.
Agree to disagree.
Right. But you.
Well, and then
if
you know
can't,
what really you're working on.
Right, but if you find that common ground that you're not real comfortable with, but you're willing to compromise, and maybe you're willing to do more than they are you at peace with that, even if you're not happy?
Right. And that's what you've got to decide, and also I think letting go of the past, and not bringing up, even as you're dealing with your neighbors and dealing in society as a whole, because if we can't
move forward,
let go of the past
yeah.
and move forward and look to the future together, if we're constantly, you did this, you did that, then you're like a dog chasing a tail.
And that's exactly right. My question on that, you had said earlier that like men kind of put stuff away in different boxes, and women kind of keep it, recycling it. So that's a good point. In your situation, to let go of the past, are you still recycling those events?
Well, I'm not one to carry grudges, which my husband will tell you, and I think
that's a good thing.
You've experienced. I'm really not one to carry grudges.
No, I don't think you are. No, I'm never.
Well,
really.
And that's not to say, but I also at the same time will look for patterns. Particularly as a mother, you have to look for patterns and say, okay, this is going to cause you a problem because you have a history of this. This
right.
is something you have not dealt with.
Right. What about like your kids' friends that were like, you may not like their friends, and you see that pattern where they're not a good influence on your children.
Right.
Where do you step in, or do you let them find out on their own?
It depends on the age of the child. Obviously. I mean, my children are now adults, so
right.
The only thing is if, of course, people who have a bad influence in your child's life as an adult is much different than a person that has a bad influence on my child as a child.
Right.
I mean, I did have a case where I told one of my children, I don't want you associating with this person anymore. There was only one incident in all four of my children that I said. Now, there was another incident where this child was not a good influence. I wouldn't say not a good influence, but was very difficult. And what I did was opened up the opportunity. Yes, this person, it was my daughter, and she had a friend that was very unfair and unkind to her at times. And what I did was told her, you can do several things. You can stop being her friend, which was not what she wanted to do. I said, you can also limit her friendship. And you can also give the friendship breaks from time to time. And what I that was showing her, she had options, she had choices. And she actually ended up doing a little bit of all three. Ultimately, the other girl ended the friendship.
Well, you gave her a guideline, though.
I gave her a guideline.
But her tolerance level might have been different than what you would have liked to seen, as far as putting up with this friend.
Right. I think I would have wanted her. There was a time when she was very young that there was a problem, and I made it very clear to the school they needed to be in different classes.
Yeah.
Because they had been in the same class
Sure.
for year after year after year. And ironically, the year after that, where they were back in class together.
But even now, as your kids are adults, and you maybe see something like that, you're not going to tell them to change, but you could put that out there so that you're maybe making an observation they don't see.
Right. And I had a friend who's years ago, when my kids didn't even know them, years ago, who had a son who was a young adult, 18, 19. And he was hanging around these individuals that were not good choices. And his mother warned him, saying that these people, even though you're not participating in the same thing that they are, your friends reflect who you are. And, even though you may not be doing what they're doing, well, anyway, they got pulled over and they found drugs in the car. And this guy was in the car with them. And he had not taken any drugs. The drugs were not on him, but he was arrested because he was in the car.
Right.
And his mother said, I'm not bailing you out of jail. And so he spent the night in jail. And when he went, she said, you better start saving your money, because if you get fined or, then you are going to have to pay that yourself because you were warned, And he did save up his money. When he went before the judge, he had such a clean record, and he was obviously a good kid, that the policeman or the judge did give him a break and dismissed him, but warned him that if he ever was caught again in a situation like this, that he would be facing jail time. And that did it.
So that was his wake-up call.
That was his wake-up call. And he was very fortunate, and actually it was a good thing because he had all this money saved, so he could do something more constructive with his life. And
that turned out good, even though it had to start out bad to turn out to a good situation. But obviously, they don't all work out that way. But that was good that did.
Well, and you want, I listened to Dennis Prager, and he really talks about that your friends are a reflection of who you are. If you have good people around you, chances are you're a pretty good person, But if you're being influenced or having people that are negative, you're perhaps sending out the wrong message.
Well, and also you start absorbing that, and you become that type of person, even if you weren't before, because you're around it all the time.
But again, too, all people are mixed bags. We all have our good, and we all have our bad. So you've really got to decide, especially when it comes to things like honesty and integrity. You want to be really careful who you're choosing, but you also got to understand, okay, I like this person, but there might be limits on that friendship.
Right. He might not be your best friend to hang out with, but if you see them, you'll be social.
Yes, and you'll be kind, and there might be things that you can find common ground and that you enjoy with them, but they're not the person who you turn to first off.
Right.
But sometimes diamonds in the rough are the best friends.
Yep.
Are the truest individuals. So just looking at someone on the surface isn't always best. So, and so we're kind of winding it down.
No. What else have you got on your list?
Well, just the society. We as a society, I think, are getting kind of not heading in a good direction in terms of our rhetoric toward each other. And you might say, I know a lot of people blame social media, but I think one of the things that we haven't touched on is personal responsibility. And
Welcome to the Socratic Neighbors podcast.
Taking personal responsibility for what you say and how you say it. I think that in a society, we need to be doing that.
Well, I think people now, not people like us, but a lot of, especially I see it in colleges with the professors and the students, they say and do whatever they want.
Especially on social media.
Right, exactly. And they're not taking that responsibility. And if you stand up to that, if you're a student, you'll get expelled or flunked.
Yeah.
So that, to me, doesn't allow the person to express themselves. And if you're going to take responsibility for what you're saying against, like, the government or other people, because you think you're right on everything, and there's a group of you that think like this, you're not letting yourself open to other people and other sides of things. It's almost like a dictatorship. It's like it's my way or the highway, and that's not taking responsibility for your actions. That's just dictating something that's not even right. I mean, you can force your opinion on someone, but that's not taking responsibility. That's just forcing your opinion on them. If you want to argue with me about something, that's great. You take responsibility for it and you own it, and then we can have a discussion. But I don't like people that just yell and talk at people instead of to them.
Well,
right.
You look at the.
But I think the best way. I'm sorry.
Sorry. Well, you look at the difference between. Do you know who Kyle Kashev is? Kyle Kashev.
No, I don't.
Who?
Do you know who David Hogg is?
Yes.
Okay. So they're both Parkland survivors.
Right.
Okay. Kyle Kashev is actually one that.
Oh, I know who he is.
You know who he is?
Yes, I do.
He's the kid that he's 2 years younger than David Hogg.
And he was actually there.
And he was actually there. And he was also instrumental in getting legislation through that will actually help.
Right.
In some form, by enabling teachers to detect warning signs, enabling law enforcement to actually be able to do something about it, all that type of stuff. And you look at the
and I remember he was rather calm in his approach. I believe that's correct, isn't it?
He's always calm in his approach.
Yes.
He's very mature for his age.
Right.
And you look at somebody like David Hogg, who basically calls Marco Rubio a mass murderer.
Well, yeah, he's kind of a rebel rouser.
He's a rebel rouser, but there are two very clear differences in approach. One is very constructive, and one is not very constructive. And it's interesting that you talk about the college aspect of it and the youth just jumping on the force your opinion down the throat type thing versus somebody like Kashev who went out and talked to legislatures and say, this may work, this may not work.
Right.
Like, this is what happened. This is what happened at my school. This is why we didn't see it. This is why law enforcement didn't do their jobs. This is why law enforcement weren't able to do their jobs. Like that type of approach is that there might be an actual way to prevent something like this from happening in the future versus going out and just saying, oh, well, $5. Like that's how much Marco Rubio takes from the NRA for every student in Florida. Right. And it's like, that's not constructive because that doesn't elicit to me, and I've brought this, I've talked to Mrs. Lotus about this, that a lot of these opinions from all these kids and all of the people that are commenting on Florida without all the facts, without being constructive, it reflects more on them than it does on the actual occurrence of the situation
lemmings.
Or the person that they're attacking.
They're lemmings. They just follow. Whoever's got the floor. If they want to drink from that Kool-Aid, they're going to follow that person, and it's sad because they're not owning what they're saying because they haven't done enough research to really know what they're saying. They get all hyped up and jump on the bandwagon, and they're like they want to start something.
Well, and I mean I can understand your concern, but how do we, at a practical level, deal with someone who we don't know? May not be in our, such as at a college, how do we constructively edify this person that we don't know and is on a quote bandwagon. And I think one of the best ways of dealing with them is asking questions, knowing your material, taking responsibility
Right.
for your opinion, and asking them questions. I know,
But
with-
unfortunately, you don't always get that. What you're saying is perfectly right. But you've got to get the person to do that. If you start asking them questions, are they able to give you answers? Well, it's just this way or this way or that way. Some people are like that.
well, that's true. And there's also people like you say, they're buried so much in their opinion. But I think dealing with people in a calm manner and asking, and aiming for that common ground. That common ground is, we don't want this to be repeated. The common ground is we don't want people who shouldn't have guns to have guns. We don't want people that have like psychological problems or criminal history and all that sort of stuff. Finding that common ground and starting there. And so that it does help the rhetoric die down, rather than jumping, well, you don't know what you're talking about and you're not thinking through your ideas.
Right.
And do you know what I'm saying?
No, you're absolutely. And in a
because
perfect.
in a way, we're
yeah.
cutting,
Right.
even though we might be right,
Right.
or they might be right, we're cutting ourselves off. from other
What you're saying
people.
is exactly what should happen. But we don't live in a perfect world. But what you say is perfect in the respect, in the sense that we can get a lot accomplished and respect each other's opinions and find that common ground where we both agree on something. That's a perfect world. Unfortunately, we don't live in a perfect world. So somebody has got to start the conversation, and people have tried, and some people are getting through to other people. It's not like nobody's trying. It's just that it may be something that we will never get to in our lifetimes. We can hope to make it, improve it, but to make it perfect, I don't think it'll ever happen.
Well, I'm not saying that it's not going to ever happen, because we don't live in a perfect
Right,
world.
exactly. I wish
But
we had
also,
utopia.
It is worth what I say. It is be worth the good fight.
Oh, sure it would be.
And it is worth even small gains.
Yeah,
Like, again, Dennis Prager says, good is often done very slowly, a little bit at a time.
right.
Whereas great evil or bad tends to be overwhelming. Yet there's something about good that is very determined and very bit by bit. And reaching for wisdom, thinking beyond yourself, thinking of the other person. And I think if we want to accomplish this, we have to be very conscious of how we speak about, this David Hogg, and the assumptions that we're making about people who are sometimes unreasonable and very judgmental of us, or of people of our opinion, and how we're speaking of them and the tone that we take. Because if we're not, we're ending up in the same you.
Right. And you make a solid point. It's perfect. And you have to start it somewhere. And then they may be all small victories, but those victories add up.
The victories add up.
Yeah, and then you feel like you have accomplished something. Are you going to change the world? No. But you try to start at home and go from there.
But a little bit at a time, you are changing the world. Because, I think most of my kids are pretty thoughtful, and we have really worked on making them thoughtful.
You said most there. Shouldn't say all.
Yeah,
There is one exception. There's some people that are beyond help.
But okay,
who shall remain.
Let's look at
nameless.
society for a minute, and we could go into religion or people of race or party or Democratic Republican Party, but give me an example like the Middle East. Those people have been fighting forever.
Right.
They've been going at it for longer than we have, and they'll probably be going on. And we go back to your topic. There's more than one way to skin a cat. How do we get countries like that to get on the same page and get along. We've been working on it forever.
Right.
And we can't get them to do that because their society is so gun-ho and they have blinders on. And they can't see what's going on. And there would be a lot of people like us that would love to go over there and try to get a conversation going.
Right.
And help them. But they're resistant.
Yeah.
So how do you break that barrier down?
Sometimes you can't. Sometimes it's an impossibility.
You're right. No, you're right.
Well, and it does start with, there are truly some acts of kindness that, being open to kindness and dealing with someone who has been unkind, and that's not really putting blinders on. A lot of people think, there's forgiveness is saying that it's okay that what you did. That's not forgiveness.
No.
Forgiveness is not carrying it with you. It's not okay what you did. But that doesn't mean I'm going to throw it in your face every time I see you, or that I'm going to rewind it in my head every time I listen to you. I try to replace those memories with new positive memories. And
That's hard to do
we're moving from
sometimes.
society to global, and global problems can't be fixed.
But
on a global
But
level.
they are different societies.
Yeah.
Right, and there's different norms, and I think history helps, because understanding history, understanding where they came from, and what the situation is very beneficial.
See, our society knows a lot of different societies are wrong in what they do in their countries. They don't follow what we do.
Right.
But in their country, they think we're wrong, and we don't follow what they do.
Well, but also you're talking about governments, and then you're talking about individuals
But it's
in
how
the
people
government.
are raised. Yeah, but people are raised. It's
But-
not only necessarily the government. The day you were born in that country or our country, you were given a set of values, and you know how our society is supposed to work. Okay, so you fit into that. Whether the government has nothing to do with it. The people you are around, they definitely have. They instilled all that. That's what you grew up around. And those people in those other countries, even though their government has stuff going on, they grew up in a society with the same people that are like them. And so they've been given this information all this time that necessarily doesn't agree with what we do, and vice versa.
Well, the part of the problem you're looking at is like with history. History is a generational thing. That's how we're able to transfer lessons that we've learned, like edification. Like my Mama Bear's passing wisdom and knowledge onto me that I may use and that I have to teach to my children.
But unfortunately, the darker half of that is also prejudices.
Yes.
And
so, but you look at just a topic like it's just a topic like racism. You look at racism. You look at in the scope of human history in the United States. The scope of human history, the United States is not that old. We're
we're
relatively
not.
we're a relatively young country.
Right.
yeah.
And it's only been 130 years since we've abolished slavery. So you've got
a little longer.
150
years. So it's been 150 years. So the scope of human history has been going on for potentially a million years, potentially. And so the scope of human history, it takes generations for the thought and the different values to carry over. And so
There's still some countries that have slavery.
there's still some countries that have slavery, but I'm talking about American history.
No, I know.
I
understand.
Is that what stemmed off of slavery was racism against black people, and that black people were inferior to white people or different races, or a particular race in the United States is inferior to these other races, or one race is superior to the other races. That's how it stemmed. And so then to fix that problem, you have to have generations that are willing to accept that no, that's not what it is. That's not these races. Just because the melanin in your skin is different than mine that doesn't necessarily negate the fact that you might be just as intelligent or just as qualified to get a position at a job as I do. You know what I mean?
Right, but that
Or
that
more
person
so.
Or
that
more
person
so.
or that person that's a different skin color. Okay, that person and myself grew up in the same society basically, but they also had their own culture.
Correct.
Because of their family, their culture is different from mine, even though we're in the same society.
Correct.
But that could be true even a person with the same colored skin.
Right, they can be a different culture, different parts of the country. People in the north act different than people in the south.
Right,
Of
and
course.
what's important and
Well, I mean, Mrs. Lotus had the culture shock when she came here from California. What? Nothing. She had the culture shock of when she bumped into somebody at the grocery store. They apologized to her. In California, that doesn't really happen. You know.
No, they give you a dirty look, and it's their fault. They'll bump into you, and they'll look at you like, "How dare you bump into me?"
You know.
Move on their merry way.
well, and I was shocked when I first moved here from California, that's where I was raised, is that people dress nicely to go to the store, or they dressed athletically, and that they changed clothes all the time, and where in California it was more of a chore. You would see people in curlers in their hair and robes on and slippers, and it was not everywhere, but in some places.
But you even get that in different parts of states. Like I lived in the middle of New Jersey, and honestly, the people in that part of the state are very friendly, very outgoing. You go to the northern part of New Jersey, and they'll cut your throat. It's just a different culture, but we're still in the same state.
Right. And, and I think that neighborhoods are more accepting, and it's the attitude in there. And even schools, schools all have different culture.
Right.
Like the school where we originally lived when Lotus was small, the school culture and the attitudes were much different than the school culture here.
Well, and you're starting to see an appeal with employers providing a company culture. Now is that not only do you have to care about what the company's business plan is or how the company feels or whatever, it's also the company culture. What's the company culture like?
The attitude.
The attitude of how people come to work. What that type of mentality.
But in that situation, though, you got to toe the company line. You have to toe the company line because they're paying you.
Right.
And even though you might not like the culture, you have to accept it.
Well, you accept it. You accept it because they're the ones paying. Right, they're the ones paying you. But that's also an appeal for applying for a job there. Because like my previous employer did not have the same company culture that my current employer does. And part of the appeal of me leaving my previous employer to go to my current employer was the company culture.
No, that's good.
I'm not doing anything. My job is very, very similar to my previous job, but the attitude of people that come to work, because we all like this attitude. We all accept the way this is going to be, and we all have the same mentality when we go to work. That's appealing to me. Because I don't want to come to work with somebody who's going to hold a grudge against me because I did the job that they were supposed to do. Instead, I want to come to I come to work. If I did his job, he's grateful that I did his job.
Right. But in your last company, though, that you said that the culture wasn't as good because you like the culture that you're in now, is there things that you could have done that maybe help try to change the culture there?
Oh,
I think that that's a good point, is that even if you're in a negative situation, you can just be mindful that what you do, how you say and how you approach, not to say that you're going to do it perfectly, but you can have a positive influence.
Right, definitely.
I did spend some time trying to figure out, because in both the companies that I work for, they're very regional based. So Texas has a region, Florida had, like in the previous country, Texas had a region, Northwestern had a region, the Northeastern had a region. The Washington area had a region. The California area had a region. Like it was the last company I worked for, it was broken up into regions of how the company operated. where I spent a lot of time trying to figure out this area in that company and trying to figure out a way how I could help. And I figured out a niche to where I developed a skill that they could go out and pay somebody else 3 to 4 times as much to do, or the company could train me. They don't have to pay nearly as much because the person that they hire is an outside person and they're paying that company contract rate versus paying.
And that's a lot of money.
That's a lot of money versus paying somebody like me who's already an employee of the company, a salaried company. So I already have that job skill. So I changed the way that everybody, all the bosses that I had in the area, because it was a much larger company, all the bosses I had in the area, I changed the way they looked at solving that problem by being able to be available to do that. And so the last boss I had, his goal was to make sure that I could be available to all of those people. And so that if that particular need came up all the time. And so once that need was no longer there, my boss would put me at his location and I would do the work. I would do the regular work that I was hired for. But
because you had that special skill.
Because I had a special skill.
And it saved them, even though it left him, that he might
down.
have to borrow somebody. It would be like, let's do a trade, and they're not paying you anymore, but you have that skill.
Well, and I'm not on his books either. I would be on the wherever I'm going, his books. So he didn't mind that because I was also more expensive. I was also the more expensive salary person on his payroll anyway. So he didn't mind that because he would get somebody that could do my job at his location, and then I would go and do the specialized skill.
And they were happy because they didn't have to pay contract price.
Right.
So he was receptive to that.
Right. And
some companies aren't though.
Right.
So how do you change that culture?
And so that's what I'm saying is that's what I did.
Yeah.
That's what I did for this area.
In your company, but
I
if you
think
run into a wall where you can't change the culture.
But that's where I started.
The thing is he's hitting the bottom line. He's hitting them at their pocketbook, and most companies
will look at that. You're right. You're absolutely right on that.
They're going to pay attention to that.
And so,
but unless they're a huge company and they got and we go back to the blender thing. But I worked for Citibank. It's huge. Okay, they got hundreds of thousands of employees. They don't look at every individual thing. They've got this corporate culture, and they've got it set in stone. And it doesn't even apply to some of the things that I did. Because they're basing it in New York City, and I was in Denver, Colorado. It's a whole different ballgame in those two states. Okay,
right.
But you can't get them to change because this comes down from the corporate headquarters. This is the way it's going to happen. Even if it can save us money, they're not interested in it because we're not big enough in our little niche to make a difference for the rest of the company.
So when they tried to take this model of me being very specialized into what I do, and they tried to apply that to other regions were resistant, and so that was part of the reason I left is because they weren't the idea wasn't going up. The ideas weren't going up. The criticism was going up, but the ideas were not going up. The ideas, they wanted all the ideas to go from the top down. And sometimes you have to listen to the people below you in order to understand how the rest of it can work.
Sure.
And you can't, what is the saying? You can't build a ladder from the
top down.
You can't build a ladder from the top down. And so if this ladder's already built and you're trying to fix it, but there's a problem with the bottom of the ladder, you have to take the ladder down to put it back up. And that was the issue I was running into. Whereas the new company, I had a client, and I had to give a presentation on that client because they were trying to figure out a way. The new company, the company I work for now, they're trying to figure out a way to retain the client. And so they said, okay, well, what worked with the show? What didn't? What do we have to attack? What do we have to show? What do we have to show where we're going to improve? And so the first thing I did was, well, if I'm having to give this presentation, I'm going to write down everything that I want to talk about. So I wrote it all down and what I wanted to talk about. And I was like, this could work in a report. So I created this report, and I called it a technical profile review. I call it a TPR. My boss uses my last name, and that he says it's the Lotus report. You know, like it's not. He says it's not the TPR to me. It's the Lotus report. You know, so that to me spoke more to the company culture that I wanted to be a part of than the last company, where I actually tried to do something, but it didn't work.
Plus, they had your name on file, so if it didn't work, you were the scapegoat.
Right.
Well, and I'd say, you know, with a large corporation or whatever, any corporation, it's like a marriage and it's not like a marriage. In that when you take that job, you got to take the good parts and you got to take the bad parts. And any job has good parts and bad parts. Any job, and I think that that's one thing that a lot of people in your generation, the millennials, don't always understand, is that any job has good parts and bad parts, and you have to shut your eyes to the bad parts. And sometimes it means closing your eyes and just doing it the way they want to do it.
You got to suck it up.
Yeah. You know, and I call it closing, you know, just close your eyes to it and just do what they tell you to do. And one thing that I shared with Mrs. Lotus one time is, you know, jobs are pretty easy in that you just go and they paying you. So you just go and you do what they tell you to do and you accept your paycheck and you go home and you're happy. It's all you have to do is show up, go on the breaks, get back on time, do what they tell you to do, and cash your pay.
What you said makes sense, but I guess my point is, what you said is right. You go home, you collect your paycheck, you go home. You can do that if you're like one of the Indians, but if you're one of the managers, a lot of times you have work to do at home,
Right?
and you've got crisis to fix that may happen when you're not there, and you may have to go somewhere in the middle of the night because there's a problem in Singapore, and you've got to get on a flight and go. If you're one of the smaller people, yeah. What's that?
That means I gotta go.
Oh, yeah, exactly. Right. There's a good example. So he's like, yeah, PapaLotus isn't just collecting a paycheck and coming home at the end of the night. He's got to go around with everything.
Yes.
But I understand what you're saying. I'm
But
not,
also that's part of the job too,
Yeah,
and you
yeah.
knew that when you
right.
when you
Or if you
hired
get
on.
promoted, then you're going to accept that.
Right.
That's
Well,
right.
You're right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's the
And
package.
I understand what you're saying because you're right. It's a job. Do your best. Take your breaks, get your check, and go home and forget about it. Don't dwell on it if you can avoid
and
it.
also the negative parts of your job you got to close your eyes to, and if you can't live with it, then yes, you can go somewhere else. In a marriage, if you can't live with it, you got to figure out another way to deal with it.
Right,
you know?
right.
For the most part, given that you're both good people and you are being faithful to each other and all
Yeah.
that sort of stuff.
I mean, you don't want the worst scenario where you finally split up and get divorced. You don't want that to happen.
No,
so you
but
try to do everything you can to
that's
keep
right,
it together.
and it takes two people
Exactly,
committedly
right?
focused to this is going to work, and the word divorce is not in your vocabulary.
Right. Because why would you get married? And yet you see people. You talk to people and say, "Hey, I've been divorced like 3 or 4 times." Something's not working, because if you've been divorced that many times, you can't blame the other person. It's got to be on you at some point. Maybe not all of it, but how many people go through that many marriages and you're doing something, not doing something right?
And my I have a cousin that went through that, and she says, "I'm just not good at picking them."
So you think you think she was okay and it was them?
Uh,
She could be. I mean, I'm not saying it's not her.
Well, judging from the guys that she picked,
She didn't do well. But
when you're
but she
talking
didn't
like
learn. She didn't learn.
alcoholics
Yeah, but
and
she didn't
drug
learn
problems and-
that. I mean, she could.
She didn't. She was not good at looking.
Is
at,
she attracted to a certain type of guy that's not good? Okay, all right, I get it. I get it.
And then she decided that's what her problem was.
I understand.
She was attracted to the wrong guys. And so.
So she has a culture she has to change. That she wants to get a good guy that she can stay
She
with.
decided not to get married anymore.
And there's nothing wrong with that either.
This has been a good topic.
Well, thank you.
It's
Yeah.
been a very good topic.
Did you got everything in that you wanted to cover? Okay,
Yeah.
good.
Yeah. So
I don't know if how you round things up, but
it's just a little
We
summary.
just
a little
talk about
summary.
yeah.
I mean,
And I wanted to just give a shout out to Barbara Bush's funeral was today, and it was very moving.
What an honorable woman.
yeah, she was a great example for all of us.
She was. I was actually crying when I was watching it.
I really have always been impressed by her being comfortable in her own skin.
Very strong too.
Yeah.
She'd call a spade. I don't want to say that, but she
Yeah,
calls
she called a
a
spade
spade
a spade.
Yeah, she would.
But I think she also called a spade in her own life, with her own children, and with her
Oh yeah, she called her out her kids. They would all say that.
and she would call that out about herself as well. But Grandpa Lotus or Grandpa Bear is needing my attention.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
I'm gonna have to,
But anyway, this has been the Socratic Neighbors podcast. Thank you very much, Mama Bear, for coming on the show.
Yep,
Being our
enjoyed
first
having
guest.
I hope that was very edifying.
That was very edifying.
Do you want to do it
Deep
again?
content.
Sure.
You
Anytime
interested?
y'all want.
Anytime? Okay.
Try to pick
Well,
a topic.
it'll
Well,
be,
think about some topics. We
Yeah.
can always do it again.
We can always do it again sometime. But thank you very much for being on the show.
Yeah.
Uh-huh. All right.
And you can find us, you can email us at socraticneighbors@gmail.com if you're interested in following up with Mama Bear or myself, Lotus, or my co-host,
QuicKarl.
QuicKarl. You can also follow us on Twitter at Socratic Podcast. We are on the Tweeters, and we'll have another episode. I don't know what we're doing for the next episode.
I don't know.
Well, I think we might take a little bit of a break.
We might take a break, and then I know you mentioned something with PapaLotus. That might come down later.
No, that'll be July.
That'll be July.
That'll be
Okay.
July when you're on vacation.
When I'm on vacation. Okay.
Yeah, you're on vacation.
I got you. I know
but,
we were talking about my son coming in May.
Yeah, so we
And
got,
we had a travel.
we've got
segment.
listener Tyler coming
Yeah.
into town in May, early May,
Mid-May.
mid-May, and then we'll probably do an episode between now and then at least.
Yeah, I'm sure.
Probably something a little bit lighter. I think I'd like to do a customer service episode after this one. A customer service episode would be kind of neat to talk about. Because whose turn is it?
You
Is
think
my
that?
turn?
You think that'd be a light episode though?
No, probably not.
I mean, we still talk about it.
Yeah. But whose turn is it to pick? Is it my turn?
Yeah, it's your turn.
It's my turn?
It's your turn.
Yeah, I'll figure out something and we'll
Okay.
discuss it.
But if you want to do something light, we can do something light
we'll do
next
something
time.
light next time. Anyway, this has been Lotus with Socratic Neighbors podcast, and
QuicKarl.
you can reach us at socraticneighbors@gmail.com or follow us on Twitter
And if you need to know how to spell Socratic, look it up.
look it up. Anyway, thanks very much for listening, and you guys have a great